Is the 90s the best decade for fantasy? Yeah, it just is. It plain is. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a decade of fantasy, and I'm starting with the 90s. And I do partially say that in jest, but I've definitely made the argument for 90s fantasy before because that has ended up kind of being my niche and just where so many of my favorite books and series are taking were being published around the 90s. And so this isn't going to be like a video essay where I like analyze in depth what makes 90s fantasy, but more of a casual, like, let's talk about, this decade. And I think this would be really fun to do with other decades too. So let me know in the comments what decade you would like to see next, if you like this sort of thing. So yeah. Anyway, let's start and talk about it because yes, the 90s have so many things. And the big one, of course, is, Wheel of Time, which obviously I'm a Wheel of Time fan, always have been. And the first 8 books of the Wheel of Time were published within the 90s. We then do spill over after that, and there are plenty of series that, like, a large amount, or at least a good amount, depending on how long the series are, takes place in the 90s, not necessarily all of them. So it definitely depends. But there are a lot of them that are either starting in the 90s or happening there. So some other really notable ones include the Wars of Light and Shadow, the first 5 books of that series that are taking place in the 90s. Realm of the Elderlings, the first 5 books, Farseer, and the first 2 of the Lifeship Traders were published in the 90s. Memory, Star, and Thorn, books 2 and 3 in the 90s, and the first book being late 80s, as well as Crown of Stars, the first 3 books is another one as well. And then Guy Gabriel Kay had Dagana, Song for Our Bone, and Lions of Albasan, all in the 90s as well, plus one of the Sarantine ones, I think. There are 4 Guy Gabriel Kay books there as well. So already I've mentioned some powerhouses because you have Jordan and you have Wirtz, some of my favorite authors, Williams in there as well. You've probably heard me talking about Crown of Stars and Realm of the Elderlings a lot. Those are huge. Guy Gabriel Kay, who's a new love for me, but also it's the books that I've read so far, which were so amazing, were also happen to be the 90s ones. So there's a lot there. And then there's also just a lot of other big series, even including some that I may not be as big of a fan of, but I should probably mention things like Song of Ice and Fire, which started in the 90s. Harry Potter, I don't know, it started in the 90s. And then everything from, you have like Sword of Truth, His Dark Materials, which I have the first book, I haven't read it yet. But then you have like some of the Witcher books, Green Rider, J.V. Jones, C.S. Freeman, also had books going on there too. So there's so much there. And there's plenty I still haven't gotten to, although 90s is a decade of fantasy that if I can read all the stuff I want to read from the 90s, that'll be pretty good. But there's a lot of that stuff, and then there are other long-running series like Recluse, for example. There were 9 books in the Recluse saga published just in the 90s, which is a lot. And technically, Malazan counts too, because the first book, Guardians of the Moon, was 99, so that still counts. So some themes you may notice just from this is there was a lot of really big series, and I feel like around and you had some of it in the 80s too, but the 90s was kind of one of the last big times where there were a lot of really big series. People were excited about it. It was okay to write a really long series, just start it and go and see where it goes. And you had a lot of that happening. And a lot of it was, really just these really big epic series. So I think that's one reason that I'm a big fan of this time period, because there were, there were a lot of those, and that's the kind of thing I really particularly enjoy. You still have some of that today, and of course there have been exceptions in different times as well. But the big series, the really long series, I feel like the 90s was a really good time for that. And it's something that I found a lot of big series that I've enjoyed there as well. Nowadays, we're a lot more towards trilogies. And now, granted, I appreciate shorter series or even standalones as much as the next person, but those really big series, I just kind of miss. And I feel like it's a lot of publishers don't really want to do them anymore. You have some people who are in the like the indie or self-pub space that are definitely doing their big series because that's a good spot to go do them. But I miss the big series, and so that's a big thing as well. Now, another thing, which there definitely are exceptions because not everything that I've talked about here falls into that sort of thing, but a lot of it, I will say, also tended to be kind of Eurocentric style of fantasy as well, in different ways, but that kind of, Western style, which is something too that, although I really enjoy trying out different things, and I love getting fresh new things, and that's another thing that I like the modern times, where there's a lot of variety there as well. Also, that is a niche that I've always really enjoyed. So, there's different time periods that you're definitely looking at, but that's something, with knights and, the swords and all that kind of stuff. A lot of them, dragons and just kind of the medieval or, later, depending on the time period that you're kind of looking at. I like a lot of exploration there. So the 90s also did a lot of that. That was very, very popular. And so another reason I think that I could talk about where I'm really, really enjoying that type of thing as well. And I think some of it too is just that the landscape has changed a little bit with as far as publishing. And I mean, even here, like you have Guy Gavrier, who I mentioned, really big, long, epic fantasy series and Eurocentric, which technically his stuff is still Eurocentric that I read so far, but it's not like the normal Eurocentric either, so it's still kind of different. So him there being an exception for sure, but you had quite a lot of that. Wheel of Time is sort of is Eurocentric somewhat and more Renaissance than medieval. Wars of Light and Shadow is very unique in a lot of ways, but has some of that basis as well, although twisted. Crown of Stars literally takes place in an alternate Europe. Of course, and Realm of the Elderlings also takes place in a very Eurocentric style kind of set thing. So it's something you see a lot of in the time with looking at that as well. And it's, once again, something that I do enjoy as well. And so I think you get a lot of that there. And so it's just, those are some patterns and themes that I definitely see when you're looking at it. And like I said, honestly, it's just when you look at the books that are in that decade, it's kind of hard to argue against the 90s, at least if you have my taste. If you have very different taste than me, which granted, you probably wouldn't still be watching at this point, but you never know. But if you have very different taste than me, you might be like, oh no, all that stuff is long and boring, and I don't like it, and I much prefer the more modern stuff, or maybe you prefer more old school stuff as well. So there's definitely a lot of different styles, but I think that's what's interesting is just thinking about when you take a look at a decade and try and categorize what fits there and what kind of books and series you have. And for me, it just so happens that a good half of my top 10 series of all time at least are within this time period. And so it's just kind of funny that that's where it's ended up. And it's not anything that was necessarily intentional. I've just happened to really explore. And this actually, I'd been thinking about doing something like this since I did my video where I did a book for every year for 60 years that I've read. And I had most of them, but I was just getting into the 90s. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so hard to compete with some of these years that are just fantastic with big books in series. Oh, and I completely forgot to mention a really big one I just realized, which is Discworld, which Discworld had quite a few novels. I don't have it pulled up because I'm a failure, and I completely forgot to add that to my list, even though it was supposed to be on the list. But let's see if we can really quickly find out how many Discworld novels were in the 90s. It started before the 90s, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Sheesh. 16 Discworld novels that were published in the 90s. And granted, that starts with Eric and Moving Pictures. So that Guards is not in the 90s, but you do have a lot of things like Small Gods and Men at Arms and a lot of the other ones in there as well too. So there's a lot there too. So that's another big one with. I think counts into the big series and epic, even though very different, obviously, from the other ones. But like I said, I think it's just interesting kind of taking a look. And I'm not trying to really delve super deep into this. But what I am curious is, have you ever noticed with your reading that there's a specific decade or style that you really go into? Because I also will definitely find myself looking at a book that I'm reading now and be like, oh, this has a very 90s fantasy feel. Or I feel like the 80s also like 80s fantasy very much. When I say that, I know exactly what I mean in my head, and things like that too. And I feel like the 70s also with kind of some more abstract and wild and different stuff too. So there are, I feel like, a lot of decades that have kind of distinct feels to them. And the more amount of time that's passed, the more you can say that, because you can kind of look back, whereas we're still developing. But that's what I'd be curious is, do you have a favorite kind of a decade, or maybe if you're not sure and you go look and try and figure it out what that ends up being, because I'd be curious if anybody else kind of has that same thing. And I feel like if you have really similar taste to me, it's probably going to be the 90s, because I know some people definitely would fall in there. But it's just crazy how many series that I love were being published around that time. So yeah, I think that's cool. So let me know, What's your favorite decade, and or what decade would you like to see me talk about next? With taking a deep dive in, the 90s is definitely the one that I am the most well read in, but I'd be curious to kind of just dive in and find all kinds of what different kinds of books are in different decades as well. So definitely let me know if you'd like to see another one kind of just exploring what was published in a decade and what patterns can we find. That's it for this one though. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the link in the description as always for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the link to the Wizardly Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether any of the books we talked about here, any other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.